focus on putting value out there and the numbers will come. But ultimately, having a plan is really what's going to make your show take off and make your show stay and make you stay invested in it. Because if you don't have that plan in place, you're done. It just won't last.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
Welcome back to the podcast on podcasting. It's your host, Adam AAA Adams. And today I'm joined with Jason Cercone. And I think, Jason, that I was worried about your last name. I was only thinking about the last name.
That's would funny. Not be the first person to botch that last name up. I've heard it all. Telemarketers shredded this thing when I was younger. Cercone,
Cercone. Obvious.
Yes.
Obvious.
Yeah. To some people. It wasn't to me. I was glad when I had phoned you and you said your name. I was like, okay, that's how you say the name. Well, speaking of Jason, who's on the podcast, he actually has a current podcast. The other one is launching right away. So maybe even by the time this is out, you could find both podcasts of his as well. Jason has a company called Cercone Consulting, which the link is already in the show notes. So just scroll down and you can connect with him at his website. You can get more of his bio, since I'm not going to read the whole thing to you right now. But I will say a couple of things, because I think they're really interesting. Number one, he is looking to break an 80 on the golf course. And I know how hard that is, because I had a 72 on 9 holes. On nine holes. Well played.
So I'm thinking like everybody's like trying to play on past me and my family, and I got a 72. And I told somebody that I got a 72 on 9 holes, but I didn't know that 18 holes was like the mark. Right. So I'm like, yeah, I got like 72. And they're like, you're good. Like, that's respectable. I'm like, that's not respectable. That's like 6 on every hole. That's like 6 or 7. I was maxing out. And they're like, how many holes did you play? So I told them, yeah, I can hit the ball far, but it doesn't always go straight.
Yeah, that's a pretty important element of the game.
It is tough. I'll hit it like behind me sometimes. So Jason is a golfer, a cigar connoisseur, a whiskey connoisseur, I'm trying to remember. There was more that was important. And
mixed in with all that important podcasting stuff are all these fun little things about myself. So yeah, steak like connoisseur, chicken wing connoisseur.
Oh yeah, steak connoisseur.
Yeah.
And you said you like filet mignon.
Filet mignon, of course. New York strip.
Why do you like filet? There's so many people that say filet is the best steak, and I'm like, ribeye's the best. I want the fatty.
I completely am on board with that. I've never met a steak that didn't have a 0% survival rate when it was placed in front of me. So it's hard to put one above the other, but fillets are just nice and soft. They melt in your mouth if they're cooked right. Does not get any better than that.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to go and try a fillet.
Yes.
Now that you said that.
Pair it with
I'm going to need you to also teach me how to cook them right.
Medium rare.
You know, the way that I like my filet mignon is made into steak tartare. It's not even cooked.
Okay. Nothing wrong with that. I've never gone to that level. I've had rare, and that's totally fine. And I would say, like, if you go up to medium, that's okay as well. If you go beyond that, that's when you're crossing a line of why are you even eating steak right now? Because you're just not enjoying it, and it's in the way it's meant to be enjoyed.
I was at my sweetheart's house. We were entertaining some neighbors, and a guy took over the grill duties. And it was not easy for me. I'm like, okay. But in my opinion, he overcooked everything. In my opinion, like,
Yeah, that's
It was just totally overcooked. And I finally, after seeing like these hockey puck burgers, I'm like, what level are you trying to go to? He goes, usually about medium well. I'm like, no, it's supposed to be rare. It's supposed to be rare.
That's amateur hour.
I like a good burger too.
Indeed.
Where's the best burger for you?
Well, here in Pittsburgh, we're a little bit spoiled because we have a couple good chains. Burgatory is one.
It sounds good.
Yeah.
And I don't know why.
Yeah. And then we have a brewery called Burgers, spelled Burghers, to play on the whole Pittsburgh thing. And
cool. They
started out as a restaurant, and their burgers are phenomenal. I mean, I think your burgers have to be phenomenal if that's your name.
Yeah.
And then they added on by putting a brewery, and now they make their own beer as well, as a lot of businesses do. So I've
flown into Pittsburgh, by the way, a couple of times because some of my properties, like I'm a real estate investor also, are in Youngstown. And it's the closest place to go from Pittsburgh to Ohio than even like the Akron or the Cleveland or any other airport that I could find. But
absolutely.
Should we jump into podcast stuff?
I'd love to. Let's do it.
Okay. Well, if you insist. So you help several podcasters yourself. What do you notice is like something that many podcasters struggle with?
I think one of the biggest problems that I've encountered, and this isn't just with the people I've worked with directly, this is what I've seen in talking with people through various platforms, is that they don't come into a podcast with a plan or realistic expectations.
Okay. So let's talk about the realistic expectation first.
Okay.
What is a realistic expectation and what's outlandish? What's too much? What's too little?
I think a realistic expectation is coming into your podcast knowing what value you want to deliver, what audience members you want to reach, and what your overall mission is with producing this podcast. I think an unrealistic expectation is saying, I've got 3 episodes out there. It's time to monetize this and make $1 million, because that's ridiculous. And I don't know what guru along the way dropped this knowledge that let somebody believe that this is something that's realistic, but it's just not. And I think that is what leads to a lot of the pod fading that we see in this industry, is the fact that people think they're going to make a quick buck from this medium. And when they don't, they're like, well, this one doesn't work. I'm going to move on to the next one. And they let their show fade away and they never come back.
There is a lot of wisdom in that. And I end up getting, I don't have very many tattoos, but the first one I got, it says persistence and determination equal omnipotence. It's just some symbols, but basically persistence and determination are like the what give you endless potential. And I see a lot of people that think that it's their education, it's their brilliance, it's their where they went to school, whatever. There's all these different things, their talents. And I don't think actually those play a role as much as not quitting. Like you mentioned that a lot of people pod fade. They start, they do a couple of episodes, and then they go to the next thing. I've seen that in all industries. People start a business, it goes out of business a few months later, because like business is hard. Podcasting is hard. Podcasting takes time, it takes effort, and the only way to become something is to not quit when you're not yet something. I think that's really good. So you're talking about realistic expectations. So you're saying that I can't make $1 million and monetize after 3 episodes. So what can I do?
Well, I think that what you can do at that point is continue to have fun, because I think that's one of the elements that gets lost along the way. When people start a podcast, whether it's for their business, whether it's for a hobby, the typical reason, or at least one of the typical reasons, is that it's fun. This is a great medium for connecting with people, for opening up lines of communication, for talking about something you're passionate about. But once you get into it and you start to realize that there's some actual work involved, it starts to become less fun. And that's where people start to walk away from it. Much like if they don't make a ton of money off right out of the gates, if they don't have the work ethic and don't realize that this is something that's going to take time. It's a marathon, not a sprint, to coin a very popular phrase, or to use a very popular phrase. If you're not taking the time to realize that after 3 episodes, okay, well, now's number 4. And after number 4 is number 5. And you're not just building one episode at a time. You're building this catalog of content that is going to last for a lifetime, for a generation. Think of it that way, and you're going to have much more fun with it, because I actually just recorded an episode of my podcast, Pod Theory, where we talked about the fact that I was probably 10 or 11 years old when I discovered the Beatles. And that had been music that was out 20 years before I was even born. But they weren't producing this catalog of great music for just one day, for 1 week, for 1 month. This was something that was meant to live on generation to generation. So if you start thinking about your podcast as something that you can actually leave a legacy behind, and your voice can be heard for hundreds of years, as long as you don't take it down, obviously, but as long as you're putting content out there that's relevant, that's impacting people, and you leave it in place, you have a chance to stand the test of time and be around for many, many years.
I love that. The thing about leaving a legacy, and how the Beatles, you found them later on in your life. You didn't know them right away, and they may have even passed away before you had a chance to catch up to them. And if that's not the case for you, generations from now, many people will be checking it out years and years and years after they have passed. So, very interesting. I like that. So, I want to go on to the realistic expectation of monetization, because I want to make sure that if there is somebody listening right now and they're thinking about starting a podcast, and they believed a different guru or whatever the case is, they believe that they could monetize out the gate, or they could monetize relatively soon. What is a realistic expectation for monetization?
I think it comes down to redefining the word and looking at monetization on multiple levels. I think a lot of people get wrapped up in the fact that when you have a podcast, well, you've got to get a sponsor and you've got to have ads to make money. And that's not the case. There are many things that you can do. And if you wanted to, you could monetize right out of the gate. Do affiliate marketing. You could have links in your show notes that will link to something that's relevant to the episode that you just produced, or relevant to the theme of your show, that when people click on it and they buy, you get an affiliate commission. So you could be monetizing technically before your show even goes live. If you wanted to go down the road of putting better value out there that connects to your brand, that's another way to monetize, because if you're putting good, relevant information in front of somebody that they are using to solve their problems, they're going to keep you front of mind when a purchasing decision comes into play. And they're going to say, wow, I was just listening to that podcast last week and they were great. I wonder if they can help me even further. Then they're going to look at your website or your social media, and then they're going to enter into your sales funnel where they can become an actual customer that gives you money. So I think there are many streams and many ways to look at it, but don't get wrapped up on having to get a huge amount of downloads just so you can get a sponsor, or so that you can sprinkle ads into your show, because ads are obviously something that can give you money, but think of it from a consumer standpoint, or as a listener. Ads suck. You know, if you're watching a YouTube video, what's the number one biggest, most annoying thing? It's when an ad pops up halfway through, even if it's for 5 seconds and you can skip it. It's still annoying. So if you're peppering your podcast with that, it's going to lessen the listener experience and make them possibly turn away. So you got to think on that level and think of alternative methods that you can use to monetize right out of the gate.
That's a lot of really good stuff. I liked how you brought up affiliate being one of the ways that you could monetize. And I liked also how you mentioned or alluded to, at least, that we could sell our own products and services also and make money that way. And in my opinion, sometimes those other ways can make more money than simply having an advertisement. And I think it can really go a long way also when it's a host read ad, even still, like where you stop and talk about something that you truly believe in and think would be helpful, versus like a total like blindsided with some other person just coming in and talking about something that you might not even need. I've had some clients that were monetizing ish. I mean, they were making pennies, but they were monetizing before they came to me as somebody to help them. And one of them had a bunch of Spanish ads, but the podcast itself was in English. And I'm like, I don't know what this means. This isn't make me excited. I can't understand this. Probably 80% of your listeners can't understand that. It's a totally different language, regardless of which language it is. Like, there's no reason to have an ad that's not in your language, and also that doesn't really serve the avatar that you had in mind as well. I think some people are missing the boat, like you said, and they are wanting to monetize, but it actually detracts from the listener experience, like you said.
Exactly.
And after realistic expectations, you mentioned additionally, a lot of podcasters seem to come in and they don't have the right plan in place. What did you mean by that? Or is it that they don't even have a plan? What's kind of that balance? Where are they, and how can you serve that person?
I think it's a little bit of both. And I speak from my own experience. When I first got into podcasting back in 2015, me and my friend, we basically, to make a long story short, we started a beer podcast out of spite because I had this guy who also had a beer podcast trolling me. And when I found out that's what he did, I said, all right, I'm going to do it better. And me and my best friend had been kicking around the idea of doing a podcast, but our idea of planning was like, okay, well, we like beer and we know how to talk about that. Let's just get some microphones and talk about it. So we recorded our first episode from a loud bar that we would frequent often because they had good beer.
Was it called Burgers?
It wasn't called Burgers. No, this was actually a different bar in Pittsburgh, but we did no editing. We didn't know really what we were doing at all when we actually sat down to record. I mean, we had a conversation, but there was nothing behind it that was legitimate. Like, you could tell, like, if you listen to it, you're like, these guys have a purpose. They know where they're going. So
there was nothing to say that.
No, I mean, it was basically that these guys are just talking about beer and when I look at them, like, looking back on it, we never sat down and said, okay, how much time do we have to dedicate to this? What do we really want to zero in on? Are there certain aspects of this that we can talk about in a more educated way? No, we were basically just looking at what was happening in the world, and we tried to make it different by saying, well, we'll also talk about sports. And I'm like, looking back on it, it's cringeworthy, because now the advice I give to anybody is to niche down, get as tightly focused on a subject as you can. Here I am starting a beer podcast where we also talk about sports. So I can speak from my own experience and screwing up and realizing that it doesn't work, because we had no plan. And then eventually what ended up happening was a weekly production became a bi-weekly production. And then all of a sudden my friend couldn't contribute as much. So now I'm doing the show by myself. And then those productions aren't getting much better. And that was where I just said, you know what? I got to take a step back. And I canceled the show. I pulled all the episodes down. So no, you can't go listen to this pile of garbage that I put out back in 2015.
So that was your very first podcast, by the way?
That was my very first podcast.
I will let you finish your thought here. Did you start another podcast in between Pod Theory and the beer one?
Yeah, what I did was, while I was still working in the beer industry, I did start one that was called the Breaking Brews podcast. And I did that for a while. And those episodes are still out there. So if you did ever want to go back and listen to that,
Breaking Brews.
Yeah, so those are there for now, and depending on when you hear this, they may be gone, because I've been figuring I'll pull them down here eventually. I just haven't.
You're just trying to do the FOMO on my listener.
Yeah. Come listen to the new
you're
podcast.
never
It's not
taking
going
it
anywhere.
down, and we all know it, but you're like, oh, you might miss out if you don't jump over there right now. All right. So can you, I know I derailed the conversation, but I'd like you to be able to finish. You were talking about 2015. It was a podcast that you, in a way, were embarrassed of. You didn't, you ended up taking it all down. And you were making a point before I asked if you had another one in between. So can you?
Yeah, I mean, the point I was driving at was the fact that there was no plan in place that would allow us to know what to expect going in. We didn't think about what is the real reason. I think I made this snap decision because I wanted to shut this troll up. So we didn't actually have a concrete reason as to why we were starting this podcast. We didn't know what audience member we were going to serve. We didn't even hear, I don't even know if we had heard the word avatar other than was the movie out at that time. I can't even remember.
The blue people,
timeline.
yeah.
Yeah, like that was probably all I knew about avatars at the time. So all of these things that I would advise anyone to think about is, okay, what kind of time do I have to dedicate to this each week? Who am I talking to? How long are my episodes? What is the subject matter? How am I going to acquire guests? How am I going to communicate with those guests before, during, and after the podcast so I can build a good relationship with them? That could lead to referrals, that could lead to them coming back, so on and so forth. These are all things that I look at now that I say these are important items to keep in mind because they're going to come up eventually. Having it down on paper where you can look at it and know this is why I'm doing this podcast and here's how I'm going to stick to it. It is going to make the show last longer. It's going to keep you motivated. It's going to make you push forward when you might look at download numbers, which is a subject in and of itself that I don't think anybody should be getting hung up on. But when you look at your stats, if you're doing that frequently, you may get upset because you're expecting more. Long story short, those are all arbitrary numbers anyway. Focus on putting value out there and the numbers will come, to put a bow on that short thought. But ultimately, having a plan is really what's going to make your show take off and make your show stay and make you stay invested in it. Because if you don't have that plan in place, you're done. It just won't last. Eventually, it'll all unravel.
A lot of good points that you're making, and I will be heading over to this part where you said, how am I going to communicate before, during, and after the podcast? And I want to allow you a little bit of time to go into that, thinking about our listener today who either just started their podcast or they are about to launch. Mm-hmm. And help give that person like more of a plan on this conceptual idea of how are you communicating with your listener before the podcast, on the podcast, and after the podcast. That's going to be really important. But I do have a tangent, of course, because we're full of them on this episode. And just randomly curious on you're talking a lot about beer. Like, do you brew beer or did you brew your own beer?
No, I never once. I mean, okay. Well, I take that back. I did do, when I had my blog Breaking Brews, I did form some good relationships with some great people that are still in that industry. And I'm still friends with many of them. I've since pivoted and gone full time into podcasting. But when I was still working in that world, I would go to the breweries and help out. So it wasn't like I was fully entrenched in the brewing process, but I was more of the grunt worker that got to clean the tanks and all that stuff. But I got to learn a lot about it. And that was enough for me. I was never one to want to actually brew the product. I was more, I like to talk about it. I like to help market it. I like to help promote it. I ended up partnering with a few breweries along the way and actually help them sell their product and build a little bit of a brand presence in the Pittsburgh market. So those were the aspects of the industry that I really gravitated to when I was into it. Okay. So never got into actually brewing other than those little day excursions to the brewery.
Okay, cool. So let's delve into communication with your listener, with my listener, with the listener's listener, before, during, and after the podcast.
Well, in regards to listeners, I think that giving value on every episode that you produce, and when I say value, I'm not just talking about the actual conversation. I'm talking about audio quality, consistency in your release schedule, making sure that if you are going to go on a hiatus and take a little bit of a break, you communicate that with your audience so they know, so they don't think that you just abandon them. Because what I think a lot of podcasters fail to realize is that whether their audience is 10 people, 30 people, 100 people, or 5,000 people, there are people invested in what you're putting out. And if you're not respecting the audience, no matter what size it is, to continuously give them that content, then they're going to say, all right, forget it. I'm going to go over and talk to this guy and see if he can give me the value that I want, because people will work your podcast into their life every time you put out a new show. So if they do it while they're walking the dog or at the gym or on their commute to and from work, you've got to be thinking on that level that if you're like, I'm going to take the week off, you're robbing your audience of the content that they seek. And then if you do that enough times, it's the boy that cried wolf. All right, well, I'm out. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to check out this new podcast. And if they get roped into that one and they love that content, now they're listening to that show instead. Now you've lost a listener. You're trying to grow your audience, but you're going backwards because you're not focused on consistently being in front of them. To me, that's the strongest way you can communicate with your audience. And then you can reach outside of your actual podcast by doing live videos, by doing polls, by starting an email newsletter where you can communicate with them that way. There's a ton of different ways that you can stay in touch with your listener. But to me, consistently producing valuable content is what's going to keep them bought into what you're doing for as long as you keep doing it.
When you said before, communicate before, during, and after, I'm hearing a little bit of the communication during. I'm definitely hearing a lot of the after, and I think we can really talk a little more about, how to get them on your email list and stay in contact with them. But I'm wondering, what you might have meant about communicating before the podcast. Is it like advertising? Is it phone calls? Is it social media? What did you mean by communicating with your listener before the podcast?
Well, I'm going to go two different directions here, because what I meant before, if you're looking to communicate with someone before, I think probably the best way that you can be communicating with anybody before. I mean, again, it's kind of hard until they have entered into your orbit to actually communicate with somebody. But if you're setting yourself up to be recommendable, then you're going to be in a good space to do that. So if anybody that's listening to this was at Podcast Movement in Nashville in August of 2021, Tom Webster of Edison Research talked about that. And that was one of my biggest takeaways from that whole convention, was the whole concept of being recommendable. If one person that's listening to your show believes in what you're doing so much that they would recommend it to a friend, you win, because that person will then recommend it to another friend, and the exponential growth goes from there. When I was talking about before, during, and after was a very important aspect of podcasting that I feel sucks on a lot of levels, is podcasters have no idea how to communicate with the guests that they bring onto their show. Now, I'll go to the end and then I'll circle back. They expect these people, as they come onto their show, to promote the hell out of the episode when it goes live, but they're doing nothing to nurture the relationship with that guest. And to me, that's the biggest part of it, because if they share your episode, great. That's a bonus. That shouldn't be what you're after. The fact that they were good enough to give you their time and come on your podcast and tell their story and communicate with your audience and help you create good content, that's what you should be valuing. If they share it on their social media, awesome. But don't ever bank on that being what gets your podcast over, because it'll never work. And even if it does, it's short-term, viral. I'll use the word viral. If somebody has a big audience and maybe they share it and it does get you a bunch of hits, you're not going to get a huge amount of consistent listeners from that one episode. So for me, the communication starts when I'm reaching out to somebody that I would like to have as a guest on my show. I'm focusing on how I'm talking to them. I'm actually calling into some of the things that they've already done. If I caught their interview on a certain podcast, I'm referencing that podcast by name. I'm talking about what I took away from that interview. This way they understand that, okay, this person's actually paid attention to me. They're not spraying and praying and trying to get 100 emails out today hoping 2 people respond. They're actually legitimately into what I have to say. So that's where the communication process starts. If they agree to be on your show, now you kick it into high gear by letting them know everything they should expect when they come onto your show. Adam, I'll say you did a phenomenal job with this, with having an application process and having a way that I could sign up, and you had all the notes in the initial email that I got that said, this is what you can expect when you come on this show. To me, that's thorough. That shows that you actually care about the content that you create. And it shows that you've taken things to a higher level with communication versus the person that says, okay, cool, we're going to record on this day, and then we never talk again. There's nothing. That person could come out of the show and have no idea what they're going to expect. So they should know through follow-up emails, whether they're automated or they're actually sent personally, which I think is a great touch, just to keep that communication going. Hey, just a quick reminder, we're going to be recording in a couple days. Did you have any last second questions? Anything I can answer for you? Well, I want to make sure that I have everything lined up, blah, 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 blah. All these things are very important. Once you do the interview, next day, be sure to send them a message and thank them. Go on your social media, either right after the interview or the next day, and say, I had a great recording with this person and they're going to be on episode 55. Look for that in 3 weeks. Make sure they're tagged so they can get excited and stay excited. Email them and thank them. Call them and thank them. Text them and thank them. Whatever means of communication you want to use. Reach out to that person and let them know that you truly valued them taking the time to come on your show and help you create a great episode for your audience. When it gets closer to release time, make sure you remind them again. Share the assets that you made that you're going to use to promote on your email newsletter or on your social media. Get all this information in front of the person. Ask them flat out, was there anything that you felt could have gone better in our interview? Their advice could potentially help you be a better interviewer for the next show you do.
What if you're afraid to hear the answer, though?
You should never be afraid to get feedback, positive or negative. Everybody wants reviews on their podcast, right? You should be thick-skinned enough to take some constructive criticism if there is something that they think you could be doing better. And you never know, it might be something you could say, okay, maybe that's correct. Or you just say, all right, well, that's something that I'm going to file in the back of my mind, but I feel that I'm okay in that area. I'm not saying you have to execute everything somebody says to you, but don't be afraid to take some feedback. But to put a bow on all of this, if you're not taking those steps to effectively communicate throughout the process, don't expect that guest to share your episode, because if you put it out, whether it's 2 weeks or 2 months down the line, they probably forgot they were even on. They're doing other things in their day. Their life doesn't revolve around being a part of your podcast. So if they see it, maybe they'll get a mention, maybe you won't. But effectively communicating is going to help you get more guests. And then on top of it, I didn't even mention this one. They may have 3 friends that they're connected to, whether they're internet friends or actual colleagues, where they could say, this was an awesome interview and you did a heck of a job keeping in touch with me. Here's 3 more guests for you. Call these people. They're going to give you a great interview too. So now you've exponentially built your guest list. Work smarter, not harder. These are all things that effective communication can do. And I experience this when I go on interviews and people are just not prepared. Sometimes people don't even show up. We're scheduled for an interview and they don't show up. I've had that happen to me. Like, all right, in a way, I'm glad that happened, because if they don't even have the courtesy to show up for the time they scheduled, clearly they don't care about their content. So I think that if people really want to improve their podcast, start with communications. Look at how you're communicating with your guests and take that to a new level.
How about on communicating with your listener? Like, is there anything that is going to help us that you haven't maybe already stated on what we communicate or how we communicate or where we communicate with our own audience?
I think that it's, especially now with social media constantly changing the goalposts, constantly moving the goalposts and changing their algorithms. Social media is a very hard way to communicate because only a small percentage of your audience will see an organic post. And I still see it. I see links getting dumped into the void on various social platforms. And I don't think social media really translates to actual downloads. It's very hard. And to some degree, you want to have that presence and you want to be there to create engagement and generate some likes and generate some comments here and there. But by and large, to build your entire audience building strategy around social media, it's just not going to work because they're constantly changing. So how do you get around that? Like I said, have a presence and be there, but narrow it down to the network that you want to be on the most. Like Facebook, I've given up. Like I don't like Facebook and I don't want to be on there. So I stopped posting on there. I spend time on Instagram. I spend time on YouTube. I'll spend a little time on Twitter, but I ultimately am looking for the networks where I can still have an impact and I have fun doing it and I have fun creating the content. So in regards to communicating with your audience, social media strategies are definitely changing. You have to evaluate how much time you have to dedicate and if it's worth that time. Because if you are constantly just spending your days toiling away with organic posting on social media, you're wasting your time. This is time that you could spend getting better at your craft. This is time that you could spend being a guest on other podcasts. And this is really the hat that the hook that I've hung my hat on in regards to building an audience. Connect with other podcasters in your space and do mutual swaps. Go on their show and have them come on yours. Start building relationships with other podcasters, because what's going to happen is you build a little bit of a network. When you have someone on your show that was really good, you can then say, hey, you should go over on Adam's show because Adam's got a great concept and I think you'd have a great conversation with him too. So start looking at it from that aspect. And when you do go on other podcasts, you're communicating with a new audience every time. If you impact that audience, they will then look at your show, because instinctively as humans, if we get value from someone, we're going to look to see how we can get more value. And if you have a podcast, it's going to be, oh, cool. Well, I can listen to them every week. Subscribe. I'm clicking the button.
Yeah.
So that to me is the most powerful way to do it.
I think that that's really insightful and true, where one of the best ways to grow a podcast is by being on other podcasts. They already listen to podcasts. 100% of the people that find you on a podcast, literally 100% of them, they know where podcasts are. They listen to podcasts, or at least they're listening to one episode. That's a minimum. Right. But let me ask you this, because you're somebody who started a podcast about beer like back in 2015, and then you started another one about, I'm trying to remember the name, but it had the name like Brew. Say it again. The second one.
It wasn't even the second one. It was the fourth one, but it was called Breaking Brews Podcast. Yeah. Me and my girlfriend did a short-lived marketing podcast. Okay. That again, that was when we did that. And then I did the third one, which was also called the Breaking Brews Power Hour podcast. That was when I shut everything down. I said, you know what? It's time for me to take this seriously. I love podcasting, but I don't think I'm doing it right. I really need to get better at my craft. So I took all the podcasts that I was doing out of play, and I just studied for a year and a half. I listened to other podcasts. I listened to people on television and on radio and how they delivered. I just immersed myself in the education of this industry before ever thinking about launching another show.
So what was the next one after that?
The next one was the Breaking Brews podcast. Yeah, that was in 2000.
That was after a year and a half of just study.
Yep. Yeah, I didn't produce a single podcast.
And then you launched the Pod Theory.
Mm-hmm.
And now, coming soon, at least today, as we're recording this, coming soon, Evolution of Brand.
Evolution of Brand. I'm very excited for that. So to speak to Pod Theory, that started in September of 2020. We're in the heat of the pandemic. And I had the idea that I was going to just do some short 5 to 10 minute episodes each day, Monday through Friday. And that was how the show started. And I feel like there's a lot of good content out there. And basically, to give you a synopsis, the show is centered around tips, strategies, commentary around the art and business of podcasting. So some of the things we talked about today, you can find them on episodes of Pod Theory. And as things went on and what looked like we were coming out of the pandemic, I don't know, as we sit and talk today, we're still trying to figure some things out. But I decided that I had reached out to a few people that I had connected with, and had them come on as guests. And I said, I really miss the guest aspect and having these conversations. I think I'm going to pivot the format of the show. So episode 125, I interviewed Travis Brown, the founder of Poddex, and we had a great conversation. And I just said, okay, here's where I'm going to cap it. And now I'm going to go to season format. And each season, I'm going to bring guests on to talk about one single aspect. We'll cover one subject for all of the episodes, but I'll get everybody's perspective. And then as I was planning it out, I realized, you know what, there's something that I've never really seen before, and I think would be a really cool concept. Instead of trying to find multiple guests for each episode, why don't I bring on a dedicated featured co-host for the whole season? So we'll do X amount of episodes, however many it takes to cover the subject matter at hand. And it'll just be a conversation back and forth with one person on that subject. And that's what season 2 of Pod Theory is going to be. That's going to be out in September of 2021. And then Evolution of Brand is a new show that's going to feature probably interviews up to about half an hour long. And my goal is to connect with entrepreneurs that have developed a brand, whether it's personal or an actual business, talk to them about their struggles, dig a little deeper than just like, oh, well, how'd you do it? Because I want to really find out, like, what were the obstacles you had to overcome? And was there ever a point where you felt like this isn't even worth my time? And what did you do to get past that mindset? And then each episode will provide at least one actionable tip or strategy that person has used, and we'll hash it out through discussion that the listeners can then take and apply to their brand. And that, to me, tells the whole story of how a brand comes to life. And that's the object. So I'm super excited for that show. I can't wait to have that roll out. So I'm planning probably October or early November of 2021 for the official launch of Evolution of Brand.
So my thoughts and my question is, like, all of your years of experience with different podcasts, you even have Pod Theory about podcasting, which the listener, it's in the show notes. They can go and click on that right now. But just my last question that I kind of want to leave the listener with is with somebody who's, I can't even now count. It sounds like 7 podcasts that you've been a part of.
I mean, I think when you count podcasts that I've helped produce, not necessarily appear on them, but shows that I've done on my own, we're around, I think we're going to hit a dozen when Evolution of Brand officially starts.
Okay.
So I've been able to help with others and be more behind the scenes, and just whether it was doing post-production, helping with recording, actually doing the scheduling, I've had my hand in at least a dozen. Yes.
What does it mean that you do the scheduling? That's a service that I'm pretty sure my team doesn't do. And so I'm curious.
Just managing the interview schedule. So because what I encourage my clients to do is batch recording. Like, let's pick a couple days and we're going to get everybody pushed to these 2 days. And then I'll manage the schedule from there in regards to communicating with those guests, so they know pretty much what I was saying earlier. So they know what to expect. They know where to go. They know when to go there.
Yeah. Cool. A lot of good stuff. So back to the question. Here's why I even started wondering about, 2015, all the other podcasts, the Brew one, the Pod one, and now Evolution of Brand, right? Evolution of Brand.
That's correct.
Yes, I'm saying it right. What are you purposefully doing differently with the one that's launching now because of what you learned through all of the other ones that you've hosted before? What are you doing differently with this one? How does that look? And how does that help a listener if they're about to launch a podcast?
I would say the best way to answer that is to go back and listen to our last 45 minutes of conversation, because I feel like what I've now put into play with all of the podcasts that I'm doing is pretty much, it's all one big package, and it's led by strong communication. To me, that's the key element in all aspects, from communicating with the audience to communicating with the guests to communicating with anybody that might have a hand in this, whether it's someone I have editing the show or doing show notes for me. There has to be effective communication across the board. And on top of that, I feel like I've reached a better level of audio quality with the podcast that I'm producing now. Way better I mean, if you want to take it all the way back to 2015, like I said, my first podcast was recorded in a noisy bar. You will never hear that again from anything that I produce. I mean, if it were something where that was the element I was in, it would be on YouTube. So you would know, because I'm never going to blindside somebody where they sit and they look at the show notes and say, wow, this looks really good. And then they hit record and it's just a bunch of people talking in the back, or I'm sorry, they hit play and it's just a bunch of people talking in the background. I think that sets the listener up for a terrible experience that more than likely they're not going to get all the way through anyway. So why even bother starting it? Do things right from the very start. And that's where I'm at. I feel like, putting 7 years of experience into this brand new podcast and with the continuation of Pod Theory, I feel like there's going to be some really good stuff coming from both shows. And that's going to lead to a couple new opportunities that I can't talk about just yet. But if you pay attention to those shows, here I am creating the FOMO again. But if you follow those two shows, as I said, Pod Theory is live, Evolution of Brand, depending on when you're catching this show, could be live, will be live soon. Pay attention to those shows, pay attention to my YouTube channel, and there's going to be a lot of good things coming for everybody to consume. And I'm
awesome.
Looking forward to rapping with everybody.
Jason, thank you. Appreciate your time. It's good hanging out, good chatting about beer and whiskey and podcasting and golf, and
could have done a whole
cigars
and separate episode on all those good things.
Yeah, we could.
But I guess, appreciate you having me on, Adam.
But if there was one thing that needed to be mentioned to the listener that was really, really important, it was that I got a 72 on a 9-hole. That's really what we need to be thinking about at the end of the day, right?
Gives you good reason to come back for more, right?
Right. Jason, thank you. And by the way, if you're listening and you want Jason's bio, if you want his links, if you want his podcast, all of those things are already in the show notes. So it's pretty simple for you. Just scroll down and click. I really enjoyed this episode. Thank you, brother.
Thanks, Adam.
And I think I didn't let you shine comedy wise. You've got some humor. And I noticed it a couple times and I'm like, dang, this guy's funny. I want to hear your podcast to see how you use that. Cause,
I'm straight man on that. I'm totally serious. No humor at all. Totally.
I doubt that.
Yeah. I can't not be sarcastic at some point in time.
Well, if you're smoking cigars and all this kind of stuff, you got to have some sarcasm. You got to.
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty sure it's sarcasm that fuels this body. It's not blood.
I recommend that you go check out Pod Theory and also Pod Evolution. Evolution of Brand. And those links are in the show notes. So just scroll down, click, and you'll be hanging out with Jason as well. Thank you, Jason. I'm going to let you go. Bye for now.
Thanks, Adam.
This episode is brought to you by GrowYourShow.com. Grow Your Show lets you be the star of your show while we handle all the hard stuff. We offer reliable and affordable post-production services that allow you to grow your show organically without all the work. So go ahead and check out the website right now and feel free to schedule a call with me and let's take your show to the next level. Again, GrowYourShow.com. You just press record. We handle the rest.